What does it even mean to design anymore? If AI can execute, if other people on the team are doing discovery, and if business decisions pull the rug out from under your work, then what's really left for designers to design? Today, I'm joined by Dennis Lenard to unpack what it means to do meaningful design work in a world that feels increasingly out of our hands. We'll talk a little bit about control, anxiety, and why prioritization and not production might be the most important design skill in your toolkit. So if you've ever been asking yourself, what is the point of all this? Well, you're not alone. Stick around and we'll try to make sense of the work behind the work. What's up, UX fam? How's your mom and them? Welcome to another episode of Beyond UX Design. I'm Jeremy. If you're new here, I am super stoked to have you. Have you ever shipped a feature that should have never seen the light of day, or survived a sprint planning where nothing got planned? Or maybe you just said, let's circle back under your breath for the 50th time this week. Well, you, my friend, have earned a Merit-ish badge. Introducing the Beyond UX Design Merit Badges, a vintage-inspired sticker series for UX designers, PMs, and engineers who have seen things. Choose from 3 sets: Soft Skills, Sharp Tongue, Cult of Figma Initiation, Pixel Pusher Survivor Kit, and more to come, so stay tuned. Each set of 5 badges celebrates the chaos and the coping and the conference calls that should have been DMs. Stick them on your laptop and flaunt them at your stand-up. Show the world you made it out of Q2 with your sanity mostly intact. Get 1 set of 5 stickers for $12 or 2 sets for $20 at beyonduxdesign.com/badges. Just promise me one thing: send pics and show me where you stick them. How often do you stare at a blank Figma canvas unsure where to start? Well, this episode is brought to you by Mobbin, the ultimate UI and UX inspiration library. Mobbin gives you instant access to over 400,000 beautifully designed UI and user flows from apps you love, and content is added weekly, so you never have to start from scratch again. Quickly find exactly what you need. Search by app category, UI patterns, or even specific features. And my team and I use Mobbin daily at work to find useful patterns, and it helps my team work much more efficiently. And honestly, I can't imagine kicking off a new feature without Mobbin. So are you ready to level up your design process? Visit mobbin.com/beyondux to get 20% off Mobbin Pro today and never run out of inspiration again. And if you haven't done it already, please consider subscribing to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you are regular here and you feel like you're getting something out of the show, I would really appreciate you leaving a 5-star review. That'll help me out so much more than you can imagine. And as always, thanks so much to Chris, Sarah, Kwan, Stacy, Radu, Megan, Andrew, John, Mark, Kevin, Jason, Michelle, Marty, Tino, Adina, and Zoe for all their support. And if you want to join these fine folks and many others and help keep the show independent and ad-free, you'll get exclusive access to the entire video library of episodes, including episodes before they're even released. Get instant access to the video archives right now for as little as $5 a month. And for more information on how you can support the show and help more people find out about what we're doing, make sure to check out beyonduxdesign.com/support. And of course, if you think the show is worth sharing, then I would love it if you told some friends. So, design, control, meaning. In a world reshaped by complexity and AI, ambiguity, all those things, we are dealing with this constantly. And often I ask myself, what the hell am I doing nowadays? If everyone else on the team can just whip out some mock-ups, what is the point of it all? Well, I think the point is less on the design side and maybe more on our intuition as designers and the skill set that we hold deep. And I am so excited to have my good buddy Dennis Lenard on the show today. Dennis is one of the founders of Creative Navy, one of the oldest UX agencies in the world. He also lectures at universities in Europe and works with students. And last year, he published a textbook about the design of user interfaces in the medical field. And still, he insists he is a practitioner, which is what he has been doing for 20 years now. Dennis, welcome to Beyond UX Design, man. I am so excited to have you on. How's it going?
Oh, everything's great, The world is burning and everything's just great. And I'm happy to be here to talk about it.
Right on, man. I love it. The world is burning in many different respects. You were not wrong. So we talked a little bit a second ago about this idea, what is design? What does it even mean? And what the hell are we doing? What are we doing? AI and all this stuff is kind of shaking up what we think is a traditional UX career. But I don't think it's all doom and gloom. The world is burning for many reasons, just one of them being the UX job market right now. But I think there's still hope, and I think this is going to be a positive conversation, so I'm really excited. So I know I read your bio a little bit a minute ago, founder of the world's oldest UX agencies. That's amazing. Tell us a little bit about you, and how'd you come to this idea that, maybe, just maybe the UI piece is not going to save the design practice?
Well, to be honest, I don't think this is truly a new thing, but it is something that we feel strongly now. Because if you think about the history of this field, UX design in particular, you'll realize that actually there was never a golden time when it was king or where it was actually able to influence a lot or when it was held in high regard. It did have that moment where it became popular in mainstream, let's say, but in the actual, factories, the places where things happen, those teams that actually make decisions, I think UX has been for most of the time just sort of an afterthought or a secondary thing. And so I think this crisis of meaning that we might experience now isn't truly new. It's just that now it has surfaced, or now that we cannot avoid it anymore.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, and now with, and I guess I'd love to get your thoughts on this. With AI coming up, I've been playing around recently with some of those AI vibe coding tools like Lovable and V0 and things like that. And it's absolutely incredible what those tools can do. It's amazing that someone has figured out how to build those things. Simple prompt turned into a full-fledged, app in a matter of hours. But it really does call into question, what is it that we are delivering now as designers? And so I'm really interested to get into that with you today. So I'm curious though, from your perspective, when you think about this idea of AI coming, a lot of people are scared AI is going to come take our jobs and things like that. I'm curious. I would love to kick off the conversation there, maybe work our way backwards. But what do you see happening now with AI and design's traditional role and our place in it? Are you worried? Are you worried that this is going to come take our jobs? Or do you think it's just another tool in our toolkit to help us be more effective designers?
To be honest, I feel a mixture of feelings. And so I'm not entirely sure. But on the one hand, there is, of course, this shock that these things can do the things that they can do. And I think that has to hit you in the face, and you just have to take it as such. So not think it away, not try to rationalize it and so on. But I think you shouldn't also jump into despair right away. Of course, if you engage more deeply with these tools that actually try to ship something with them, you realize that actually they wouldn't be able to take a job right now. And maybe they would be able to do it eventually, but we don't really know. Because that, something that actually works in practice and ticks all the boxes is incredibly complex, and the nuance there is very important. Will the tools be able to do that? We don't know. If we look at simply text generation, where of course the tools are much further ahead, the answer is still very unsure, because you might say, well, yes, but sometimes not. It's complex. I think with design, it ought to be even more tricky than that. But I think we shouldn't kid ourselves, and we should actually make an effort to see this as an opportunity and to use all of these tools, because that's what we want to do at the end of the day, right? We want to produce an outcome that is not the work itself. And so anything that helps that outcome is welcome in principle, leaving our emotions aside.
It's interesting because humans, we are, inherently emotional beings. And so when we see something as doing what we can do, in the case of AI, creating screens and things like that, and in some cases, full-fledged apps, so even engineering, I think they're often concerned about this as well. We get scared. And I think one of the reasons this is something that we want to dig into today, this idea of control, I think one of the reasons why we're often frightened and the first thing we think of as doom and gloom is because we very rarely have control over the work. And as designers, we lament this a lot. Product managers will come in and tell us to do one thing, and we end up being pixel pushers and things like that. And we often have very little authority, very little overall control of the end-to-end product lifecycle. And so I'd love to get your thoughts here as far as that idea of control, and what does that really mean for a lot of this? Because if somebody, I think what a lot of us concerned with is, a founder, a CEO, somebody will say, well, AI can just do it. Whether or not it can actually do it. If the CEO thinks the AI can do it, they're not going to hire that designer. They're going to let that design team go, and they might regret it, but that doesn't matter for the people who've already been laid off, right? So I'm curious, tell me a little bit about that. I'm curious what your thoughts are there, is this idea of control and how it relates to this sort of uncertainty and ambiguity around our jobs.
Well, you know what? Let's start at the most intimate level of control, where I'm thinking, right, when you're in a meeting, you don't have the experience of control. When you're in Figma, the task as such, probably you don't control, but you control what you do on the screen. So Figma, I think, feeds that element of control. And so if an AI comes along and says, I can do exactly that part, moving things around on the screen and making boxes or whatever it is, I'm taking away the part that you control most. So I think, in a way, it is natural to have a very strong emotional reaction to that. I don't think you should deny it or even wish that you wouldn't have that, because it's very normal and human. What does that mean for the bigger picture? I think there are lots of opportunities and dangers in here. I think the biggest danger of AI in general, but in particular in this case, isn't what it can or what it can't do. It is what people think it can do. Because you're absolutely right to say, the CEO or whoever tries to take the part that you do, the things that they don't see, they try to replace you with that machine. That is dangerous because they would absolutely do that. That's exactly what people do. And the problem is that people are willing to accept something that doesn't work or something that is a substitute for a solution as long as it is cheap, comfortable, whatever other attributes you want to name. So that's, I think, the danger with AI, that we will stop trying to do quality outputs and so on. What we will do is we will all pretend that we're doing something, and we will eventually have a world where, we have a bridge somewhere that collapses the moment it is built, but it's also built in a place where there are no roads, there are no people, no nothing, and it doesn't even look like a bridge because it looks like a church. So it's a complete absurdity. And then someone would ask, well, why is that? Because everybody in the whole chain just kept using AIs for a long time, and nobody really cared about, well, does it do exactly everything I wanted to do, or is there noise? I think AIs take noise, they give it a shape, trying to convince you that it means something, but it doesn't actually. So I think that's also the point where designers still can make the difference. And maybe in the process of finding the place you will get laid off. I hope not, but if it does happen, I think there's still this place of designers are needed in order to make things mean something to people. Because otherwise, you can create 5,000 apps and you will earn exactly $0 from that because they don't mean anything. So the quantity doesn't compensate for the quality.
Well, you brought up a good point about, people thinking design is the, the screens and the things like that, and they see AI being able to do it. And let's ignore, for the sake of this conversation, the fact that, my personal opinion, I'm sure lots of other designers will share this opinion. Whether or not other people will share this opinion, I think is irrelevant because they're the ones often making the decisions. But the design from the AI is often not as good as the output from a human because it's, regurgitating all the other things that have trained it and things like that. So it's often, not original. It's somewhat generic, and it looks, it isn't the best possible solution. Ignore that for a second, because I think other people like CEOs, they don't necessarily always care. They just want something to be released, ship it, we'll make a bunch of money. It doesn't matter how it looks necessarily. So let's ignore that for a second. But if the rest of the team sees AI cranking out designs and they say, well, I don't need a designer anymore because the AI is cranking out designs, but we know we're still useful as designers. Whether you call yourself product designer, UX designer, it doesn't matter. I'm curious, in that case, if those people think design is the UI on the page, is there some other way for us to define quote unquote design in this case so that, we can bring something to the table that AI won't? And how do we approach that conversation to make, I hate to say find relevancy, because I don't want it to be like we're grasping at straws trying to find relevancy, but I think we know that we bring a certain skill set to the table that is still useful that AI can't. So I'm curious, defining design, what does design even mean? If AI can quote unquote design a UI, what does design mean for designers now?
Well, I will tell you, first of all, what it doesn't mean. Design isn't the output. We create an interface. An interface means a place where things collide, and where they work out a way of coexisting at the same time. And many times that's lots of different things. We always think about the users as the ones who arrive in this place, calling it the interface. But there's also the whole technical aspect, the whole database and everything. There's also all of those elements of the rules by which people engage and so on. And then there's the company, the stakeholders and so on. So it's a complex place where lots of things clash. And I think the element of design is managing this process. And part of it is managed in the interface as such, the layout with the buttons and so on. Part of it is managed in the way this thing evolves, the way we manage the system as something that breathes and lives and evolves. So I think many times it's not about, right, designs always are put into a place where they're supposed to think about how to fix the system. But I think instead we should think about ourselves as shepherds of the system, or as the ones who actually wonder about what is the system trying to teach us, what can we learn from it, and how can we manage this process. The element of managing this process explicitly and educating the others about this work that we do, I think is something that we're not used to doing a lot as designers. And maybe one of the reasons is precisely that we felt comfortable thinking that, well, people cannot take away our job because they don't know how to use Figma, and so we don't have to explain it. And it's easier to talk about the buttons because those conversations are less contentious than the question of what are we even doing as a company, or why don't we have the ability to add more value and so on. This is, I think, where designers can work on, but that also means that we have to start to do different kinds of work and to communicate in different ways. Lots of tasks that we might not be used to.
Yeah, I love that. Well, so let me ask you this then. In that case, because often this is, again, going back to the idea of control, often designers have very little authority and very little influence, and we're often just order takers. And so I'm curious, as designers, how do we start to exert some more of that influence so that we can shift that conversation to change it so that it's not just the sort of like, what do you do in Figma kind of stuff and thinking about designs and things like that? Do you have some advice, like any thoughts there about how we might change that conversation so that we aren't just seen as the order takers?
Designers oftentimes are janitors of broken intent, is what I say. Which means that, right, you have lots of different stakeholders coming there with whatever their intent is, but they didn't really think it through. They didn't consider everything, and then just throw that at you, and you're supposed to figure it out. And you try to mop it up the way you can. But I think being in this role and maybe having been silent in ways for a long while means that maybe you've made certain observations that the others haven't, or that perhaps you have a broader perspective over how all things come together to produce certain outcomes. So just thinking beyond your role, but thinking about the whole workflow that actually leads to an outcome where you're just a tiny part. So if you stop thinking about how does this affect me, but how does this bigger thing actually function? I think if you reflect on that, and as a designer, I think you're particularly well equipped to reflect on that, you can start to make observations. And then I think what you can do is you can try to surface these observations to the others. So really educating them about how the organization works that they are in, highlighting what works well, what doesn't work well. Maybe at some points you can even demonstrate how this whole chain of decisions and the mechanisms that sit behind them, how they lead to a particular outcome where you say, hey, look, here we missed an opportunity to generate more value for users, or this catastrophe happened with people complaining about this particular thing. If we would have worked differently in the past, this wouldn't have happened. So this type of reflexive work, I think, is important, and it shows that you actually provide value to the organization, whether that ends up being in pixels or not. Because the thing with designers is that at the end of the day, I think we are the only ones who actually care about the users. And I think that is important because no matter how you define the goals of an organization, you will have to have customers, and they have to be some kind of humans, because otherwise the whole thing doesn't make sense. And so as long as you can understand the humans and see how this whole machinery that is the organization ends up interacting with the humans, whether that is through the user interface, digital one or not, it doesn't matter that much. If you understand that, you can help with there being a relationship between the two that is actually profitable and perhaps even useful to the users. So that means that you have to get outside of your role, make observations, and then also surface them to the others, start to educate them. Now, depending on the types of colleagues you have, this educational part may be easy or more difficult, but something you need to do.
That's really interesting. You mentioned something, that I often think about, and I don't know if this is good or bad necessarily. One is better than the other. I don't know. But you mentioned, being user-centered and things like that. And then the thing that I think about often is this shift from, our titles as UX designers to product designers. And so we've completely removed like user from our title now. And so it's interesting, you mentioned as designers, like we're the ones who care about the users, but in many cases, user has been completely stripped from our name, from our title. We're often given tasks that relate to metrics, business metrics, churn, or, conversion rate, or some other business metric that often is more focused on improving outcomes for the business and less improving outcomes necessarily for users. But you mentioned something that's really interesting. It's like, and this is the paradox I always found really bizarre when people talk about needing to understand business value and things like that. And I think this is really important. But at the same time, users are not going to pay for a product that they don't want to use. And so what's good for the business should also be good for the user, because if it's not good for the user, no one wants to pay. And then it's not good for the business. And so it's kind of interesting. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but I've always sort of lamented that shift from UX design to product design. And it's honestly one of the reasons why I still would consider myself a UX designer first, and why I call the show UX design, Beyond UX Design and stuff, because I still feel like users should be at the center of this thing. And yes, we are building products and things like that. And I don't necessarily have a problem with the product designer title, but I also think that the user should still be a main variable in our equation, but it's often just not. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that. It just is what it is, I guess. But
when I speak to potential customer, I always introduce myself as a product designer. and I tell them exactly what you're saying, that look, all the others, they're user experience designers on our team and they deal with the users and so on. So the user will be well taken care of. But I'm the one who will think about how this affects your business or making sure that works for your business. And I think that's interesting because, right, people might be worried that we're too user centric, that we might ignore their needs. But I think a dynamic, and this is truly horrible, is that I think that you have tech giants out there who have a monopoly. So this idea of doing something for the user isn't really that important anymore. And designers are actually sort of in the role of exploiting the users, putting it dramatically. So it's like a slaughterhouse where you design with the user in mind, but the user doesn't have to survive this whole thing, so to say. I think that can happen. That is still somewhat rare. I mean, the vast majority of digital systems are not of this kind. I think a lot of them aspire to be that, and luckily it's difficult to actually achieve that. The thing here is, however, that it's always a matter of time. Well, you're absolutely right. Eventually, a thing like that collapses. And I think that's already baked into a company of that sort. It's just the thinking that, well, if we can keep this up for 6-7 years, we will have extracted so much money that we don't care if it collapses at that point. But the thing is, I think if you're, but you have to assess, I think, as a designer, if you are in that situation or not with your company. If you truly believe that that is the case, then I don't think you can change much about it. You can try, and I think you might want to try, but also you have to be realistic. You might then think about moving to another company, which is not easy to do in this job market. Either way, you have to consider that there are lots of other absurd jobs out there where you do something that's in a way horrible or not, up to the perfect moral standards. But it's important to be clear about that. However, it's always a matter of time. And I would say, well, if AI truly helps us do things that easily, then maybe being in that situation, understanding how that company truly, affects negatively the lives of people or of society and so on. If it's that easy to just put out there and then use AI to make an alternative, or maybe go to the competitor and say, look, I super understand this market. I can use AI to generate things. You and we can do something amazing in here. It will take a few years because this thing has to collapse first. But if you work with me, in 3 years, you will be the next big thing.
It's really interesting. I don't know, man. I personally, to your point about changing titles because the business team doesn't take you seriously because they think you're too user-centered, or they think, you're too focused on users and less on the business. And that is absolutely something I've seen. And so I totally understand that shift. And, I don't know. It's like, I feel like an old man sometimes, like, oh, back in the day, things were better, but were they ever really? I don't know. But one of those things that I think this points back to again is this sort of idea of control. And, I don't know that a lot of designers had the say in what their titles were. It was really whatever the HR team decided to give them. And some people were called product designers, UX designers, user experience designers, UX architects, like whatever it is, A lot of times those HR titles were just completely made up by somebody who had no idea what a designer did or didn't do, or a product manager, engineer for that matter. And so, again, it goes back, I think, to this idea of control. And at the end of the day, I mean, it's a job, right? Like we're here to, I think some designers, and I often wonder this too, this is kind of interesting. I'm curious to get your thoughts, off topic, I guess. But when I think about our role and the rest of the software team, I feel like, and this is maybe because I don't know enough product manager engineers, but designers are often the most altruistic people on the team, where we want to save the world. We want to save the user. We want to do all this stuff. We have these morals. But then when I think about product managers, they're there to just do a job. Engineers are there to just get paid, they want to write really clean code and they want to do really great work and things like that. But, they're not going to die on this sword. They're not going to die on this hill. They're not going to fight people and make enemies. I think at the end of the day, they're just there to get a job. And it's kind of funny. I don't know. Designers have this sort of weird altruistic thing. And I often wonder, taking us back to the thing about AI and control, I often wonder if that's hurting us in the long run, because we are trying to be the moral authority here. And we're trying to bring this altruism to this conversation when, AI doesn't care about altruism. It's just a tool. It's there to build stuff. And I don't know, we're fighting against it. And I don't know, other people just don't seem to be fighting it like we're fighting it. I'm curious if you have any thoughts there, but it's kind of something I've been thinking about a lot.
It's a good observation you make. One thing that's important and we shouldn't confuse here is that these other individuals, they're not, the thing that they're selfish about is not the business, they're selfish about themselves. So that is a vulnerability. because that generates a lot of incoherence, a lot of issues, and so on, that eventually also affect them or affect others, and so on. So in this noise, I think when you have someone who says, you know what, I can see the bigger picture of what we're doing here, not just as a team, but maybe also with our users and so on. And I can understand how you all run away, just run around with your own interest in mind, but that generates a lot of chaos and a lot of issues for you as well. If we did things a little bit different, everybody would profit. I think that there's a lot of potential and a lot of force in that. Of course, the difficulty is getting people to actually follow you or to do what you want. I think that is the thing that makes the job so difficult. So I don't know if this thing has any worth. I personally think this type of thing is worth pursuing more than your own self-interest. But I do know very well that this makes the job much, much more difficult because you have to make meaning out of the absurd, if you will. And control plays into that, but you cannot, right? You cannot control chaos into order. Order can only emerge if you engage with the chaos in the right way, but you cannot force chaos to give you order because the only thing it does is it precipitates chaos. That's why it is a very difficult job because you're faced with, let's say, a very cruel reality. This discrepancy between how you see the world and how you wish it to be and the way it is. That's very cruel, this kind of discrepancy. It really, really hurts. I think it's not just imagined hurt. I think it's actual hurt. But that's one thing. The way you engage with that to make something better arise out of that, that is the difficult part. But control isn't the way to do it. It's more, I think a useful skill is to notice order, notice patterns. As a designer, you're a pattern noticer, more so than others, because if you only focus on yourself, you can only see some of the patterns, those that are meaningful to you. If you can let, those preconceived notions that you have, if you let those go a little bit, you see more patterns and perhaps more meaningful ones that sit beneath everything. And then you can hopefully influence things a little bit better.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that's something that's kind of fascinating about this whole conversation as it relates to AI is it just increases the ambiguity, which ultimately I think a lot of times increases anxiety. And when we get really anxious, right, survival mode kicks in and we just focus on ourselves and surviving. But I think if you just sort of take that step back, and I read a book one time that was really interesting, and they talk about, when you're in the weeds, when you're in everything, imagine you're on a dance floor and you can only see the person next to you dancing. But if you get up on a balcony and you can kind of look out and see everybody dancing and whether or not everyone's dancing kind of in unison, and you're able to kind of make connections and see those patterns when you would never see them if you're just on the floor, focused on the person next to you or focused on yourself. And so the analogy there, I think, taking this back to like AI, it's creating all this anxiety. Anxiety puts us in this stress mode. We get these endorphins, whatever chemicals in our brain that cause stress. And we get into that self-preservation mode and we just think about ourselves. But if you take a step back, I think, and analyze it from that balcony or be more observant and try to look around, you can kind of see how you might apply some of these things to your own career. And I think the challenge here is every software team functions differently. Every software team expects a product manager or designer to do different things. And so it's hard to really give general advice, but if it's up to you to sort of take a step back and analyze your own situation and figure out the best path forward for you. But being stressed out makes it really hard to do that. And I want to talk a little bit more about this idea of control as it relates to AI and how that's shifting roles and responsibilities. And I think about you look at like product managers versus designers, you traditionally sort of make like a Venn diagram where we've each got things that we do, obviously, but then there's a lot of overlap in the middle, especially when it comes to discovery and research and things like that, or requirements writing, things like that. AI changes all that up and makes it even more ambiguous now because you could do a lot of the things a product manager could do. They can do a lot more things that a designer can do with AI tools. And so that creates a lot of stress and things like that. And unfortunately, a lot of times, product managers are the ones at most companies that have more control. They often control budgets and resources and things like that, and designers don't. And so that, again, creates a lot of professional anxiety about your own job and job security and things like that. And so, I don't know, I want to dig into this a little bit about just this idea of AI shaping and reshaping. How do we sort of take a step back and do that observation to be able to sort of look at our own specific situation and move forward in a positive way for us? You have any thoughts there?
I would break it down into a number of steps. The thing I would start with is take the company or the product or whatever it is and the users, maybe even research the competition a little bit if you don't do that all the time. If you haven't done it in a year, just do some benchmarking and see it. And then I would say, well, okay, considering the way the world is now, future trends and so on, how well does our product actually support our users? And it's impossible that you don't find a lot of things that need to improve. And then the second step would be, okay, are we the team that actually ships to that vision, or do we ship something else? And find the discrepancies in there. And then think about why, as a team, don't we ship that? And I'm sure it's always a mixture of reasons and it's complex and so on. But just try to observe this complexity without really judging and so on. And then think about, okay, well, this product manager, what role does he or she play in here? In what ways do they support this potential vision, or would they, or can they support this vision? In what ways do I think they're not really doing it, or they can't do it, and so on? And then I think the next question should be, okay, since I see all of these things now, or I have a certain image of them, how can I actually support the product manager to do that? It might be they're not good at this thing, or they're good at this thing, but they miss a particular detail about it. What if I supply the detail? What if I do this? What if I take this over and so on? There's probably, you should have a lot of conversations with the product manager, not just do things and say, look, I've done everything now, just enact my play that I have in here. But I think if you approach things in this way and you have the right conversations with this person, what will happen is they will say, you know what? This is actually interesting. I don't like everything you say in here, but half of it is interesting. And this idea that you will actually be able to support some of these things is great. And that's how you become relevant. And I think that's how you support the product manager, stay relevant in your job, support the team, and also support the company. But you have to consider all of these at the same time, because if you just think about, oh, I'm in danger, I will think about how to please the product manager, it's not going to work. Or if you think, oh, I will please the users now, again, that's not going to work because you're in a much more complex environment than that. So you have to consider all of these, but you can.
Yeah, so you mentioned something here about obviously needing to have many conversations with the product manager. And this is something I think is so important. Relationships, critical to building great software. You've got to have really great relationships and talking to those people over and over again. Again, this is sort of like looking at your own personal situation. We could give blanket advice and generic advice and assume product managers will do this, engineers will do that, CEOs will do this, stakeholders will do that. But all of these individuals are individuals. They're all people. They're all unique with their own ideas and thoughts and perspectives and ideas on what is right and wrong. And, we could sit here and give blanket advice, but you've got to have those conversations with those people to understand what they're looking for, how they work, and get into those processes to have more influence or to ask those hard questions, like you said, right? Because if you don't have a really great relationship with somebody and, humans are just weird things, we're weird animals. I have no relationship with you. You send me an email and ask me to do a bunch of things. And then I just reply with a bunch of questions. And, I'm like, well, who are you to ask? Like, I've already done all this stuff. I don't need you to ask, but if you've got this ongoing relationship with product managers, one-on-ones or regular syncs or whatever it is, and you start to bring these things up, you're not questioning them. You're just working together and you're kind of building consensus along the way, and you're bringing them along for the ride, and they're part of the discovery, and you don't have to fight over who gets to ask this question or who gets to schedule this meeting. You're just sort of doing it all together from the beginning. And I think that helps you figure out, together, what AI tool can I use? How can I be more efficient? What things can I bring to the table that this product manager isn't doing? Or how can I supplement them or take work from them if they're busy and things like that to help build that trust over time and have those conversations. And so anyway, I love pointing that out because I think that's so important. We could speak in generalities all day long about how to use this tool, that tool, and what it means for you. But at the end of the day, like only you know, right? And only you know your specific situation. And so I don't know. Anyway, I personally feel like that's just such a critical thing as it relates to this whole conversation of control and anxiety and AI. Is you have to understand your own very specific company, situation, peers to be able to make the right decision for you. And I think that gets lost in a lot of like the dialogue on LinkedIn and other places where people just give advice. But what might be right for one person might be completely wrong for another. So I don't know if you have any other thoughts there, but I think that's just really important to call out.
What I was thinking is if you were a designer, designing something, right? You would, for example, you would go to the users to try to understand them better. And you would try to do that in an unbiased way. So you wouldn't want to bring your emotions or preconceptions to the type of research. You are also a designer of yourself and of your role and of what you do in a company. And you shouldn't forget that. It's easy to forget. And sometimes maybe it's good to forget it for a year or two so you can focus on the work. But eventually come back to that. And then you have to think, well, who is my user? Well, the product manager is my user. So I should try to consider their situation from their perspective, not mine. I have a lot of things to say, but let's leave them aside, see things from that perspective, and then try to build from there. Because I can imagine some people might have a very open product manager who would say, yeah, sure, let's do a one-on-one. I'm really eager to hear all your ideas and so on and so on. Others might say, no, my product manager doesn't, they don't have time. They're not interested in new stuff because they have too much going on and so on. I would say, oh, look, that's great. That means you already understand some things about this person. Then if that is the case, and again, if you were a designer, you would think about alternatives. I cannot give you that thing that you want because it's impossible or whatever it is, but I can try to solve your needs in a different way, or I can try to capture your attention in a different way. Do the same thing with the product manager. So, just since you're a designer, apply the design thinking to yourself. It is difficult, and that actually will help you with empathy, because oftentimes as designers, I think we're a little bit, I don't know if we're hard on people, but we ask them to leave their emotions aside about how difficult it is to implement something, or how much pain we would have to endure for a while until this thing gets shipped and so on. And, we ask them to do the thing that is better for the long term. Well, now you have to do that for yourself. And that will again teach you about how to have empathy for people who say, this is a great user experience, but it's too difficult to code.
I love that. That's such an important thing. Like empathy for users, we talk about it all the time, but we often forget about empathy for our team and where they're coming from. This is something, again, like I think a huge opportunity for us is, as these problems, we like to think of ourselves as problem solvers. I'll caveat that by saying, like, I do believe that everyone on the team is solving problems in some way. We don't have a monopoly on solving problems, but if we understand a lot of these AI tools, we can use them to our advantage to help alleviate some of that stress, some of that work, whatever it is. The product manager is really busy doing a thing. Can I take some of it off your plate? Because I do think there's a lot of overlap. You're writing a product requirements doc, a PRD or something. Can I help with it? Can I help fill this thing out? Can I take a couple sections? Can I help write some requirements? Can I help do blah, 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 whatever that is. And then you could use AI or something like that, ChatGPT or Claude, whatever you use to help come up with some of these things. If you aren't even familiar how to do it, you could use AI to teach you how to do it or show you examples and get better at it so that you can help them do it. And then you're building up your own skill set, your own human capital, and now you're worth more because you figured out how to do a thing you didn't know how to do before, or you figured it out already and you just help take some of that off their plate. And so they're going to trust you. And then next time, maybe they will include you in conversations when they didn't before. So anyway, I think that's awesome. And I love that. I want to shift a little bit to the designer's advantage and like what we can actually do going forward, some actionable things that we can do to think about to make ourselves, more valuable to the team. What do we actually bring to the table? How do we shift that conversation to show and highlight some of those skills that we can do that AI actually can't? And you mentioned in our prep call, this idea of prioritization is that edge, that intuition, that designer's intuition that we have. Talk to me a little bit about that. Like AI can produce and they can spit out stuff, but they don't make those decisions. They don't decide what is important and what's not, or, what's a better idea than another. They just give you a bunch of crap and you have to shift through it. So tell me a little bit about that. Prioritization as the designer's edge. What are your thoughts there?
Well, I'm sure that everybody, or, most people know the double diamond model. But I'll just remind you that, well, it's a complicated model, but the basic distinction it makes is between designing things right. So that's obviously the formal things of, does this thing look nice? Is it coherent and so on? But then the more fundamental question that sits aside of this question is, are we designing the right thing? So asking the more fundamental question of what should we even do? And I think AI works on this front of just having a page where things are aligned and so on. Basically, we tell it what to include in that page in the prompt, or some of it figures out. But this question of what should the prompt even be, right? What is it that we're actually doing? That's the most important one. Because no matter how many designs you create that look nice, if none of them are the thing that you actually need, it doesn't matter. That's why I say the quantity doesn't make up for the lack of quality. And the deeper you go in the pyramid of thinking, the more important the quality becomes, right? With the prompt, if you point it towards the wrong direction, it doesn't matter how many credits you have on your AI to generate versions. And I think designers are really, really great at understanding this, precisely because they also work on the front of actually putting together the flow or the page. And while they do that, they realize that actually there's a conceptual problem that lies deeper, or there's a contradiction with some other feature set or whatever it is. And when you notice these, maybe for a lot of people, the thing to do is to just keep on going and just ignore them and wing it and do workarounds and so on. The better thing to do is to actually go back to the drawing board and say, hey, we have a conceptual issue in here. And if you have this resource to generate outputs quite easily, then you can spend more time working on the fundamental things. And so that's what you need to do. And that's where the idea of prioritization comes in. Because even if it becomes cheap to develop things, it becomes cheap to design things, there's still a cost. If it's not the cost of production, it's the cost of opportunity of bringing that to the users. So that's where figuring out what even needs to be done is the most important thing. And then also the order in which things should be done on all of that. You have to keep in mind that the thing that we are capable of as people is making sense of things and making, human meaning out of things, right? An AI can get you transcripts from call recordings. It can even analyze a little bit of the emotion that you can hear in a call. It can summarize that. It can weigh things, right, depending on how often someone said something and so on. But it is only a person who can really have the empathy of a user who, let's say, swears on the call and uses inappropriate language. The AI would say, oh, they use inappropriate language, that's not appropriate, we will ignore this, or whatever the reaction of AI is. While as a human say, I know the feeling of that. And I know that when they say that means more than what the others said, or something like that. I think that's the skill. The same way in the way we interact with the team. So I think this is using that as much as we can will actually transform the products that we do and the way we interact with the team. And so it will become irrelevant how much time you spend in Figma or what AI can do, because that's where the value is. Especially as time goes by and it's easy to generate an output, there will be a competition not for the Figma designs and not for shipped apps or shipped lines of code. It will be for exactly this element of meaning making. So there might be a painful period now because it's chaos and people are still adjusting. Once things have settled, where let's say putting out an app that is the same as Airbnb, with the same power of the lawyers, with the same power of the ads and so on, will become accessible to anyone. The question becomes, well, how do you maintain your position? Well, by making sure it still means something to people who also see through this again.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. So, it's interesting. You mentioned a second ago, moving fast, shipping fast and things like that. And I often think about, move fast and break things. It makes a lot of sense, I guess, in a way for a social media app when all I'm really doing is sending cat pictures and things like that. And I don't want to diminish the work of people who work at social media companies or anything like that. But, move fast and break things, it's low stakes, I think, a lot of times. If we're wrong, I don't know, it makes it harder for me to like send a message to my, friend or something like that. But you work in, the medical industry, med tech and things like that. And I often think of like, financial institutions, fintech and things like that, where, designing something incorrectly or shipping something incorrectly, I'll say, can actually have a very negative impact on users. And I often think about, a lot of the things that have gone wrong in the financial system where, there was like a design flaw that like, I don't know, was it Bank of America? They lost like $1 billion or something because someone selected the wrong input field, or, there was I think that one kid, this unfortunate incident with, I think it was Robinhood, maybe. I can't remember if it was Robinhood. The kid thought he lost his life savings or something and then like committed suicide and things like that. But it was just a UI issue or something that was just confusing. And, obviously med tech, like doctors dealing with stuff or patients dealing with already often traumatic scenarios, having to go and deal with insurance and, all this like incredibly stressful situations that they're in. The wrong decision there can have a huge impact. And I think that's kind of one of the places where, again, thinking about our role in a monolithic way, if you're designing something at Meta, for instance, I don't think the process should be the same as designing for a UI or something for doctors to do endoscopy surgery, right? I mean, those are like very different scenarios, and the processes that we would follow and how we might use AI or how we might make decisions, how often, how fast we ship, things like that. Those processes should be very different. And I think we're often lumping those two roles together to our own detriment. And I don't necessarily think we should be telling Meta how to do their job, and Meta, the social media type companies shouldn't be telling UX professionals that work for those other companies how to do their job. So it's kind of interesting. I don't know. Anyway, it's just sort of not really a question, more just like a series, a train of thought there. But I don't know if you have anything to say about that, but it's kind of interesting when you think about, our roles and how we might use AI or where we use it or how we interact with our product managers and things like that. Anyway, kind of interesting for me.
Well, what I would say to that is that the processes are different. So when you design for a medical device, the whole process is very different. One of the reasons is that before you are allowed to sell anything, it has to pass through regulation. Then you have to show how you designed it. So some of these things that we do and we think we're, smart for doing them, where we do use research and testing and so on, in the medical field, you have to do them, and you have to consider that type of input, and you have to document it and demonstrate that you did it. So the process is different, but I think there is always a benefit from learning from the other. Because the tricky is not so much about whether you should do something like user research, right? That's an easy question. Of course you should. But the more nuanced question is about how much and how should you do it so that it is useful. And I think that's where the question is. So obviously, if you're biased towards pursuing it in a way that's too formal, maybe you would benefit from being a little bit clever. Whereas if you're clever all the time and you don't have any structure, and maybe the structure is not optimized for what it should be, then you should reconsider the way you structure things. But I think the important thing is, right, this idea of fail fast, fail often, and so on. The merit of that is that what it actually says is not so much, make an effort to fail, but what it actually says is be aware of your biases, try not to let them to influence your work too much, and try to get to know reality and design for reality. And this question of what are the biases that we actually put into design, I think are very important, especially now that we integrate AI. Even if we don't use any AI to generate designs, just ChatGPT to generate requirements, that creates a lot of bias. The question then becomes, well, how do you counter that type of bias? Because you might not be aware of it. You might be, because ChatGPT is very persuasive, or all the other text generators. So this again means a whole new area for users, for designers to work on, to develop their skills, especially considering nobody knows how to do it. There's no course for that. You have to invent it yourself.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. Again, like, it just keeps going back to this idea that, like, the way that you do any of these things in your own in your own team, your own core team, your own company, whatever, they're individual, they're unique. And so, we're here trying to, give blanket advice or generic advice because we're on a podcast talking to people we have no idea what their specific situation is. But I think it's just like critical thinking here, right? Like, just like anything else, how might we apply those skills that we use to understand users and have that critical thought to our own career and our own specific situation at work and things like that? And I think we often just don't do it. But I think AI is so scary for so many people that it makes it like so hard to do that, because you're in like survival mode, like we said. It makes it really hard. So I want to talk about from here, like, where do we go as designers? What do we do? And let's see what kind of, like, actionable advice that we could sort of talk about. I think the first thing that I think is really important to think about is, we work in a system. We work in a group of people that work together. That's a system. It could be complex. It might be simple. It might be very complicated. It might not be, but we often don't fully control those things. How do we work in that system that we often, as we said, we don't really have that full control without losing ourselves in that chaos? How do we do that as designers?
Well, I think it's more difficult to translate it into practical advice, but at the level of principle, the consequence of this situation that you described is that you have to make a constant effort to observe the system and to try to understand it. So never should you say, I understand the system. You should always say, I am in the active process of trying to understand the system. And the same thing you should do with yourself. Try to actively understand yourself and to, let's say, define yourself, or to make sure that you constantly adjust what you do, which is very uncomfortable. And this is the whole thing with AI. Gives us the promise of comfort, which we love. At the same time, it gives us this threat of taking away the control and the comfort that we have. This comfort zone where we feel that we have control, it's taking away. In a way, I would say that's awesome. Let everything burn down to the ground. Or it never even stops burning, right? It just keeps burning. But recognize that as such, and in this burning, make an effort to understand the system that you work in and the way you work. Let's try to make this more practical. I wonder how many designers have created a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, for their team, for their organization, for themselves. Probably never. Maybe you should do it every 2 years. I think if you did that as a practical thing, as silly as it feels in the beginning, and you will feel silly doing it, but again, don't let that emotion deter you, and don't try to suppress it, don't try to run away, just do the SWOT. Do that. I think if you do that, if you have those 3 sheets of paper in front of you, from that, you will already see at least 40, 50 practical things that you could do, where you would see, hey, here we have some overlaps, here we have some contradictions. That gives us what I could do. I could work on bridging some of these contradictions. I could surface this to the team and hear their input, whatever it is. This is already something, at the very least, it will make your superiors say, oh, this person is different than I thought. At least that they will say. I thought they're only good at Figma stuff, but this is interesting that they would even do that. Now, the thinking is partially right, partially I disagree with it. This is already a conversation starter. You already have a job for another 2 months, let's say. But it's also, if you devise a plan from that, if you involve others in that plan, I think you have a job for the next few years.
I love that. Yeah, that's great advice, man. And again, I think you can't do that. You can't do that SWOT analysis without, those one-on-ones and talking to your team regularly and understanding more deeply those people that you work with. And so, like for me, almost every time I do a lot of coaching, and one of the questions or one of the answers that I usually default to more than anything is, one-on-ones. And that's sort of like, we talk about using our toolkit, our UX toolkit, to help us better ourselves in our job and things like that. And, research, like that's your research, that's your user research there. You mentioned earlier, product managers are your users. They are using the output that you have created. How do you get to know what they need or want or care about if you're never talking to them other than through like DMs or emails? Like it makes it very hard. So, those one-on-ones, those are really important. I think small talk in the beginning of meetings, like we always, especially remote now, we just like sort of skip straight to it. Spend 5 minutes just getting to know your team a little bit to have them open up so that when you do have a hard conversation later, it's just a little bit easier because you're on friendlier terms. We don't have to be like best friends with the people that we work with. They're not family. But we do need to know them on like I should know at least that you have some kids or you have a dog or a cat or you live in a certain area and you like to do certain things, like those little things, I think go so far to help uncover all those other things that we're discussing. And so anyway, I don't know. To me, I don't know if you have any thoughts there, but to me, like those are just so important. Like that's like the foundational stuff. So often I hear people just like you said, like, oh, my product manager's busy, or they never want to talk, or they just send me emails with lists of things to do, or a Jira ticket or whatever system you use. And sometimes you can't change that because those people are just set in their ways. But
I have an anecdote about that. One of the most painful things in our team is when the chief of design tells you that the research wasn't done right. And the context for this is, you've been working on something, you've tried, I don't know, dozens of solutions, none of them work. Then you say, well, this thing cannot be solved, or the requirements aren't right, or whatever it is. And then he always says, no, it means you haven't done enough research. And then you say, but I've researched everything, I've looked at everything and so on. He says, no, it's still not right. And that is very frustrating and it is annoying. But he has a great skill at just recognizing where something is incoherent in a system and where it doesn't add up. And what happens is that you then go back to the research, you do it again, probably the same way you did it before. Then you go back to the chief of design and he says, oh, you still weren't able to figure out. That means that even the second time you did the research, it wasn't right. That's very unfortunate and very frustrating, but the only solution is to do the research right this time. But by going through all of this motion, which is very frustrating and so on, you do get prepared to better understand maybe what you did wrong. Eventually, it's not a linear process, but also you accumulate so much emotion that you prefer to do anything that is radical and out of the box instead of just keep being in that situation that's very frustrating or scary or whatever it is. And then you try something that is daring and radical and nobody had thought about it, but it actually addresses the problem. And then you do the right research and then the things fall into place. So that's why I think where you mentioned do the research, and I'm sure nobody does the research when it comes to how do I engage with my team, because we're all designing, we don't do this kind of research. Well, let's start. Because the good news is if you've never done this or have done hardly anything, then anything you do now will be valuable and will help. And then even if it's painful, the message is it will lead somewhere. You don't know where it will lead, that's fine. It will lead somewhere.
Yeah, I talked to Thomas Wilson recently, and we talked a lot about stakeholder mapping and power mapping and things like that. And when I think about, all the ambiguity that AI throws into the mix as far as, our jobs and roles and responsibilities and things like that, going back and looking at who controls what, who has power over who, stakeholders, how they like to communicate, how they relate to each other, who, has whose ear, right? These little things. When even if you don't necessarily create an official stakeholder map or power map, just thinking about those things brings so much insight to help you make better decisions about any number of things. And so, that's something too, like you said, doing the research, I like to apply them in use that framework of stakeholder mapping. That's most teams never do that. Designers, especially, I don't think ever do that. Maybe a product manager will put together a stakeholder communication plan or something. I don't even think I've really ever seen product managers do that. That to me is like just such an important step. Even if you don't put together a communication plan, even if you don't put together any kind of official document or artifact, just sitting down with like your core team and having those conversations is so far beyond what most people do that I think you're going to be in a really good spot. So that's something that I really like to do too. So the next question I want to ask with ambiguity, right? This is something that I keep coming back to. AI throws all this ambiguity up or creates all this ambiguity, and we end up focusing on the fact that we can't control things. And I think a lot of times we don't focus on the things that we can control. So I'm curious, like, what can we as designers start to do today, tomorrow, to try to hold on to that focus and not get lost in the mess of the ambiguity and worry about the things we can't control? How do we start focusing on the things that we can control?
Of course, first we have to identify them. But I think that that's a good point that you make about focusing on the things we can control, because I can imagine a lot of listeners thinking, well, what you describe is me doing a lot of things I'm not doing currently, and I have to work at levels where I'm not really working on, and I don't even know how that's going to go. It's sort of outside my area of comfort and my area of control. And until I get there, I can't do anything. But you can actually work within the framework that you already have and just make small changes. For example, if you now have your meetings where you present designs and so on, just be more conscious about the time you spend describing what is on the screen, which is obvious to anyone anyway, and the time you spend explaining the thinking behind them, and maybe then also the time explaining the assumptions that sit behind that thinking. If you can change the proportion of that even a little bit, you explain more of the design thinking, and if you explain the assumptions that thinking is based on, that then you have already made a step into this element of being reflective about how we work together as a group. Because the assumptions, you don't invent them, they come from the group. And then I've had so many engagements where simply surfacing that, look, there's this dynamic in the group, and you have that assumption, you have that assumption, there's a clash in here. How can you check these assumptions and so on? Many people say that is incredibly revealing and interesting, and sometimes it's even more interesting than the design work. And here, you don't change anything about the structure of how you work. You don't change the meetings. You don't request a one-on-one. You just do that.
Just do it. I love that. That's great advice. Just like, it's so hard. I mean, it's human nature to just worry and focus on those things that we can't control and worry about them endlessly. But just do it. Just like focus on the things you can't control and go from there, and like let that, be your guiding light. I think that's something that we often just don't get that advice very much. And I think a lot of times social media, LinkedIn, clickbaity stuff, it's all doom and gloom, and it focusing on that kind of stuff, doom scrolling, on social media about the current AI or the current job market and how AI is killing the UX career and things like that, or the product design career. I don't think it's helpful. And people are just doing it to sell, ads on websites and get clicks. And I think if we just realize that, we will all be better off. So Dennis, man, now we've had you for a while now. This has been an amazing conversation. I know we didn't touch on everything we said we wanted to talk about, but this is, I feel like we could talk for another couple hours if we wanted to. Before we get out of here though, anything that we missed that you think is really important to touch on before we end the conversation?
Well, a final point, by the way, of what you can control and what you can focus on. The smallest, tiniest thing that you can control and that you should focus on is your attention. So, we've talked about huge things, about smaller things and so on. The smallest thing, if you were to apply yourself to the smallest task, the smallest thing there is, apply yourself to your own attention, and that will radically change everything in time. It will take time, and working with your own attention is difficult, but, doom scrolling, all of those things, they take away your attention. Emotions take away your attention. So just work with your attention. If you do that, do it every day, half an hour and so on. In 5 months, you will see results.
It's all little things, little steps, baby steps.
Yes. But it adds up. If you work on the right thing, it adds up and it makes everything easier.
I love it. All right, Dennis. Well, before we get out of here, I have got a series of questions I like to ask all my guests to help our listeners get to know our guests a little bit better. But before we do that, let everybody know where they can find you. Give your agency a plug. Let everybody know where they can find you. If you got any other stuff you're working on, let us know. Give yourself a plug.
Well, creativenavy.com. I think it's it's a nice corner of the internet to visit because we share a lot of what we do and we give a lot of detail that I think most others don't. In our case studies, in our blog and so on, there's a lot about what we do, the detail of how we do it, the decisions that we make and so on. So if you're bored, you can drop by.
All right, check it out. We will include all that stuff in the show notes, creativenavy.com. Check it out. You guys are doing some awesome work. All right, before we get out of here, I got a few questions I'd like to ask all my guests to help our listeners get to know our guests a little bit better. First thing that comes to your mind, you don't have to think too hard about it. What is your favorite non-design book?
Look, there's a great book. It's called Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino. I think it's a book every designer will love. I won't tell you more about it. It's very easy to read. It's deep. It's poetic. It's aesthetic. It's profound. It's anything that you want it to be.
Right on. I love it. So it's summer right now. Is a good summer poolside book? Is this a good one for the pool? It's easy
Absolutely. You can read it in a train. You can read it in a pool. You can read it anywhere because it's very dreamy and it just makes you float away.
I've been trying to read less and less nonfiction. Like I've been reading a lot of design and business books and things like that. And I'm trying very hard to read more fiction this summer. I've already read one book and I'm halfway through another. And so I'm trying to get my poolside reading in. So I'm going to add it to my list, man. I love it. I'm always down for a really good book. All right. Next up, what is your favorite non-design podcast?
The one I like best it's very famous. It's called Philosophize This, but it's great because it makes, complex thinking very, very accessible and it's always interesting.
I love it. Yeah, that's a good one. It is really easy to listen to as well. It's not like super academic. So that's a good one. I like that one a lot. That one is on my rotation as we speak. All right, next up, what is your favorite meal? This could be something you cook or your grandma used to cook, something you had at a restaurant, travel somewhere. Favorite meal?
Look, I would say grilled lettuce.
Grilled lettuce.
Which is not entirely true because I should say grilled anything. But last week I tried grilled lettuce in a restaurant. It surprised me because I thought it's going to be horrible, but it was great. So apparently, if you grill anything, it's going to be great.
So grilled lettuce. What kind of lettuce is this? Like some kind of hearty lettuce? Because I think of grilled lettuce. First thing I think of is like romaine or iceberg lettuce or something.
Yeah, no,
like
I don't know exactly what kind, but it was cut in a way to keep its structure. And I guess it didn't grill it long, but it's just amazing.
All right. I'll look this up, man. You've got me intrigued. I've never heard of grilled lettuce before, but there's a restaurant, a Chinese restaurant close to me that's like really, really good, authentic Chinese food. And it's not like, crappy takeout, but they have like a couple of dishes where they put it on top of lettuce and like the heat from the food like wilts the lettuce. And I'm like, every time I order, I'm like, can you guys just not put it on a bed of lettuce? I don't want the lettuce. But that's obviously not grilled.
No,
but it gets like hot and soggy and it's gross. Anyway, all right. I'm going to check out grilled lettuce. I'm going to Google. I'm going to make a note to look this up. All right. I'm going to check it out. All right. Next up, what is your favorite vacation spot? You're like out there in Europe. You're in London right now, I think?
Yeah. But my favorite, well, I would say if someone says Italy, I would say I know it's going to be great and fun. Let's go. But the truth is, any kind of forest makes me happy. So that's the secret to my vacation.
I love it, dude. So where are you from originally?
I'm from Germany.
Yeah, a lot of forests and beautiful old wood forests out there.
Not primeval forests, but still.
All right, man. Next up, what is your favorite design tool that is not Figma?
I would say Notion, and I realize it's not really a design tool. But the power of Notion is exactly sort of what we've been talking about, putting order to thought, communicating that thought to others, using it as a repository where you can come back to. I use it a lot that way, and I think it helps design a lot because of that. So it's not visual, but it is a design tool because it makes the design process run better in all of these ways that we described. You can also use something else, but Notion just has the structure that you need somehow.
Yeah, I love Notion. I just love like the database aspect of it. You could pull stuff in and filter. I love like the drag and drop. You can use Markdown to style text and put columns and kind of organize it really interesting ways. Yeah, I use it for all kinds of stuff. I use it for like coaching clients and templates for this and templates for that. It's really great. Notion's my favorite. I meant to ask you, when you were in forest, do you do a lot of camping, or do you like, cabins in the woods, or when you go to the forest, where you like just hike?
Yeah, all of them. But what I do most often is, especially if I can't stay long, just sit there in a hammock and just enjoy it the way it is.
Do you have a favorite forest?
Oh, I never thought about that. I like a forest that at least feels primeval. Not those managed forests where all the trees are arranged in grid lines and so on. I don't know, if you have a waterfall, if you have logs to get over. So this feeling of it being the wilder the better, of course, maintaining safety limits. But it is a completely different type of chaos, because it feels like chaos to like someone who lives in the city, but it is somehow reassuring. Never been to a forest in the United States, and I know that there's just so many, but my thinking is, I would take 3 years and just be in the forest over there.
I love that. Well, I was going to ask if you've ever been in the Pacific Northwest, like Oregon, Washington area, but they have these like almost tropical rainforests, like, and just big ferns and lush greenery, and it's just beautiful. I've never been up to the Canadian side, but we've done some hikes and stuff up in outside of Seattle and Portland and stuff, and man, it is so beautiful. It's like primeval. Like I just imagine like a T-Rex stomping through the forest or something, but it's just this like lush rainforest out in, I don't know. Anyway, beautiful. It's beautiful. I love that. Anyway, if you get a chance, check it out. You would definitely dig that. The cool thing about Seattle too, you could be like hiking in the mountains like 1 hour, and then the next hour you're like on the beach having a margarita. It's like so this weird like kind of close to the beach and the water, but it's still kind of like up in the mountains. It's really neat. It's one of my favorites.
So shut up and
places.
Take my money.
Yeah, if I had a travel agency, I totally would.
I think so.
It's all free advice. You don't. Yeah. All right, Dennis, this has been amazing, man. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate this. I think this is such an important topic for us to think about, even if you don't necessarily take any actionable things away from this conversation today. I just think making it. I hope that it makes you think and you start to apply some of that critical thought to your own personal situation and your own skill set, and how you can take AI and realize that it shouldn't be scary. It is a thing that can disrupt, but disruption doesn't always have to be a bad thing. It's how you manipulate it and use it to your own advantage. So I hope this has been really great for a lot of people listening. So Dennis, thank you so much for coming on, man. I really appreciate it. Thanks for coming on. Well, all right, y'all, that's it for Dennis and me for today. I hope we helped to shed a little bit of light on what it really means to do meaningful work when AI is changing the game, and why our value goes way beyond pushing pixels in Figma. But what do you think? How has AI shaped your own experience as a designer so far? Let me know what you think on LinkedIn, or shoot me an email at hello@beyonduxdesign.com. I'd love to hear from you. If you like what you heard today, don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you feel like you're getting something out of the show, I would love it if you left a 5-star review. That would help me out so much. And if you know somebody who might find any of this stuff useful, then why don't you tell them about it? That would be fantastic. And if you've listened all the way until now, you've definitely earned a merit-ish badge. Whether you've survived tricky team dynamics, Figma fiascos, or pixel-perfect feedback loops, there's a badge with your name on it. Grab 2 sets for $20 at beyonduxdesign.com/badges. Just promise me one thing. Show me where you stick 'em. Help keep the show independent and ad-free. Check out beyonduxdesign.com/support to find out how. You can join Chris, Siraquan, Stacy, Radu, Megan, Andrew, John, Mark, Kevin, Jason, Michelle, Marty, Tino, Adina, Zoe, and many others, and help keep the show independent and ad-free. You'll get exclusive access to the entire video library of episodes, including episodes before they're even released. Get instant access to those video archives right now for as little as $5 a month. And if you're tired of staring at a blank Figma canvas, Mobbin gives you access to over 400,000 beautifully designed UI screens and user flows with a library that grows bigger every week. Kickstart your creativity, streamline your workflow, and level up your design process. Visit mobbin.com/beyondux to get 20% off Mobbin Pro and never run out of inspiration again. Remember to sign up for the newsletter and check out all the past episodes along with all the show notes at beyonduxdesign.com. I hope you keep coming back for more great UX tips from Beyond UX Design. And until next time, remember, you're more than a designer because there's more to UX and design. I'll see you around. Take care, y'all. Before we get out of here, sorry. So, where the hell was I going to say? I was going to say something. Oh, I forgot. Beauty of post-production.